There is an economic pattern in history that has destroyed three of the world's greatest empires over the past 2,000 years. This pattern follows 7 distinct stages, and each time it has played out, the result has been catastrophic financial collapse. What makes this pattern terrifying is its mathematical precision. It does not matter how powerful the military, how vast the territory, or how dominant the currency. When an empire enters this 7-stage sequence, economic laws take over, and the outcome becomes inevitable. Ancient Rome dominated the known world for centuries, controlling trade routes from Britain to Mesopotamia. Their economy was the most sophisticated the world had ever seen. Within 300 years of reaching peak power, Rome's economic system collapsed completely, and the empire fragmented into chaos. Spain in the 1500s and 1600s controlled more wealth than any nation in human history. Spanish galleons brought hundreds of tons of silver from the Americas every single year. The Spanish real was the world's reserve currency. Yet Spain declared bankruptcy 4 times in 40 years and descended into economic irrelevance by the 1700s. Britain, in the early 1900s, ruled the largest empire ever assembled. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. London was the financial capital of the world. Within 50 years, the empire was gone. The currency collapsed, and Britain became economically dependent on the United States. 3 empires, 3 complete economic collapses, and all 3 followed the exact same 7-stage pattern. This is not speculation or theory. This is documented economic history, verified through financial records, trade data, and currency devaluation records that span centuries. Understanding this pattern is not about predicting doom. It is about recognizing how economic systems fail when fundamental principles are violated. And right now, the United States shows clear signs of having completed 5 of these 7 stages. Imperial economic collapse does not begin with military defeat or foreign invasion. It begins with economic exhaustion. An empire extends its commitments beyond its productive capacity to support them. Military garrisons must be maintained across vast distances. Trade routes must be protected. Client states require subsidies. Bureaucracies expand. And all of this requires ever-increasing amounts of money. At first, the decline is invisible to those living through it. The currency still functions in daily transactions. The military still wins its battles. Tax revenue still flows to the capital. But beneath the surface, the productive foundation erodes. Resources are misallocated away from wealth creation and toward wealth consumption. The tax base shrinks. Debt accumulates. Currency debasement begins. Then comes the acceleration phase. Trading partners start seeking alternatives to the dominant currency. Creditors become nervous and demand higher interest rates. The military becomes unsustainable to fund. The advantages that once made the empire powerful transform into vulnerabilities. A currency that everyone demanded suddenly comes flooding back home as foreign holders sell their reserves. Military commitments that demonstrated strength become financial burdens that cannot be maintained. Promises that were once guaranteed by economic power become empty words backed by nothing. This is not theoretical. This happened to Rome, to Spain, and to Britain. Each time, the empire believed it was different. Each time, the economic mathematics proved them wrong. The pattern does not care about cultural superiority, technological advancement, or military dominance. The pattern is about productivity versus consumption, revenue versus expenses, and sound money versus debased currency. When these fundamentals break, empires die economically, regardless of how powerful they appear. The 7-stage pattern of imperial economic collapse follows a logical sequence. Each stage creates the conditions for the next stage, and once the sequence begins, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse without painful economic reforms that empires rarely choose to make. Stage 1 is military overextension. The empire commits to defending too much territory and fighting too many conflicts simultaneously. Military spending consumes an ever larger share of the budget, leaving less for productive investment. Stage 2 is currency debasement. Unable to fund commitments through taxation alone, the government degrades the currency to create more money. This can take the form of reducing precious metal content in coins, or, in modern times, printing unlimited paper currency. Stage 3 is the debt spiral. The empire borrows constantly to bridge the gap between revenue and expenses. Debt compounds. Interest payments rise. Eventually, the empire borrows just to pay interest on previous borrowing. Stage 4 is loss of productive capacity. As the economy becomes financialized and dependent on currency manipulation, actual production of goods declines. Manufacturing moves elsewhere. Agriculture stagnates. The empire becomes dependent on imports while exporting its currency. Stage 5 is social and institutional decay. As economic opportunity evaporates, social cohesion breaks down, crime increases. The talented emigrate, trust in institutions collapses. Political dysfunction prevents necessary reforms. Stage 6 is loss of reserve currency status. Trading partners develop alternatives. Foreign central banks diversify their holdings. Demand for the currency drops. The currency that once dominated global trade becomes just another regional medium of exchange. Stage 7 is economic collapse. The system implodes rapidly, not gradually. A currency crisis triggers a debt crisis, which triggers a political crisis. The empire fragments economically, and within years or even months, a superpower becomes a cautionary tale. This pattern has repeated 3 times with remarkable consistency. Let us examine each case in detail. The Roman Empire at its peak in the 100s and 200s AD was the most economically sophisticated civilization the world had ever seen. Roman currency, particularly the silver denarius, was accepted from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East. Roman roads facilitated trade across 3 continents. Roman law protected property rights and enforced contracts. The Roman economy generated wealth on a scale that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. Stage 1 began with military overextension. By the 200s AD, Rome defended borders stretching thousands of miles. Legions were stationed in Britain, Germania, along the Rhine and Danube rivers, in North Africa, in the Middle East, and throughout the Mediterranean. The cost was staggering. Roughly 70% of the imperial budget went to military expenses. Soldier pay, equipment, fortifications, and supply lines consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. Stage 2 was currency debasement, and this is where we have precise historical records. In 64 AD, under Nero, the denarius contained approximately 95% silver. By 100 AD, it was 90% silver. By 200 AD, it had dropped to 50% silver. By 270 AD, the denarius contained only 5% silver. The remaining 95% was base metal. The government reduced the silver content to produce more coins to pay soldiers and bureaucrats. But merchants were not fooled. Prices exploded. What cost 1 denarius in 200 AD cost 50 denarii by 300 AD. This is documented hyperinflation caused directly by currency debasement. Stage 3 was the fiscal crisis. Tax revenue collapsed because the economy was shrinking, while the debased currency destroyed savings and trade. The government imposed ever harsher taxation. Property taxes, sales taxes, inheritance taxes, professional taxes. Tax collection became predatory. Those who could not pay were enslaved. Those with wealth fled the empire or hid their assets. The government began confiscating property outright. This destroyed what remained of productive economic activity. Stage 4 was loss of productive capacity. Roman manufacturing declined dramatically in the 300s AD. Quality goods were increasingly imported from beyond the borders, from Persia, from India, from Germanic tribes. Roman agriculture suffered as the best land was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy families, while small farmers were crushed by taxation. Food production dropped. The empire became dependent on grain imports from Egypt and North Africa. When those supply lines were threatened, cities faced starvation. Stage 5 was complete social breakdown. By the 300s and 400s AD, Roman cities were shadows of their former selves. Infrastructure crumbled, aqueducts fell into disrepair, roads went unmaintained, bandits controlled the countryside. The population declined through disease, famine, and emigration. The talented abandoned the empire for more stable regions. What remained was a hollow shell of bureaucrats, soldiers, and impoverished citizens. Rome did not fall to a single barbarian invasion. Rome collapsed economically and then fractured politically. When Germanic tribes finally entered Italy in 476 AD and the last Western emperor was deposed, it was merely the final act of an economic tragedy that had been unfolding for 2 centuries. The Roman economy died long before the Roman state officially ended. Spain in the 1500s was the first true global superpower. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Spanish conquistadors seized control of the richest deposits of gold and silver ever discovered. The conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1521 and the Inca Empire in 1533 gave Spain access to mines that would produce unimaginable wealth. By 1550, Spanish ships were transporting 200 tons of silver annually from the Americas to Spain. By 1600, that number exceeded 400 tons per year. Spain controlled the money supply of Europe. The Spanish real was the global reserve currency. Every major trading nation needed Spanish silver to conduct international commerce. Stage 1 was military overextension under King Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598. Spain fought wars simultaneously across 4 continents. War against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, war against France in Italy, war against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, war against England, culminating in the failed Spanish Armada of 1588, military commitments in the Philippines, ongoing conquests in the Americas. By 1580, half of Spain's annual revenue went directly to military expenses, and it still was not enough to cover the costs. Stage 2 was currency debasement. The Spanish crown began mixing copper into silver coins. A real that was supposed to be pure silver became 50% copper, then 75% copper. The face value remained the same, but the actual metal content plummeted. By 1600, Spanish silver coins contained barely any silver at all. Merchants throughout Europe stopped accepting them at face value. Inflation erupted. The very silver that made Spain powerful became worthless through debasement. Stage 3 was the debt spiral, and Spain provides the most dramatic example in history. Spain declared bankruptcy in 1557, just 1 year into Philip II's reign. They defaulted on debts to Italian and German bankers. Then they declared bankruptcy again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. 4 sovereign defaults in 40 years. Each time, Spain restructured the debt, made promises of reform, and immediately resumed borrowing and spending. By 1600, interest payments on Spanish debt consumed 40% of annual revenue. Stage 4 was loss of productive capacity, and this is where Spain's story becomes a warning for every empire. Despite possessing all the gold and silver in the world, Spain produced almost nothing. Spanish nobility considered manual labor and commerce beneath their dignity. Why manufacture goods when you could import them with silver? Why invest in agriculture when foreign food could be purchased? Why innovate when wealth simply arrived on ships from the Americas? All the silver that entered Spain immediately flowed back out to pay for imports. French wine, Italian silk, Dutch manufactured goods, English wool. Spain became a conduit for wealth, not a creator of wealth. By 1600, Spain manufactured virtually nothing. The country was entirely dependent on imports and entirely dependent on continued silver flows from the Americas to pay for everything. When silver production from American mines began to decline in the early 1600s, the entire Spanish economic system imploded. Without silver to export, Spain could not pay for imports. Without imports, Spanish cities faced shortages. Without tax revenue, the government could not function. The economy contracted violently. If you are enjoying this deep dive into economic history and want to see more content exploring how financial systems rise and fall, make sure to subscribe. We have many more economics-focused videos coming that break down complex financial patterns using real historical examples. Stage 5 was social and economic decay. By 1640, Spain lost Portugal in a revolt driven partly by economic mismanagement. By 1650, the Netherlands, Spain's wealthiest European territory, was fully independent. Spanish cities filled with beggars. The productive middle class emigrated to France, England, and the Netherlands, taking their skills and capital with them. Spain was left with unproductive nobility, an oversized military it could not afford, and a bureaucracy administering an economy that no longer existed. By 1700, Spain was a second-rate power, still large on paper, still holding colonies, but economically irrelevant. Spain never recovered from this collapse. Today, Spain is a pleasant regional European country, but it holds no significant economic power on the world stage. The descendants of the conquistadors are a tourist destination. That is what happens when an empire violates economic fundamentals. The British Empire at its peak in 1900 ruled approximately 1/4 of the world's land surface and governed over 400 million subjects. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Every major international trade contract was denominated in pounds. Every central bank held British government bonds as reserve assets. London was the financial centre of the world, controlling global capital flows and setting international interest rates. Britain appeared invincible economically. But the seven-stage pattern was already underway. Stage 1 was military overextension. By 1900, Britain defended an empire spanning 6 continents. Military garrisons in India, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The Royal Navy maintained supremacy over every ocean. The cost was enormous and growing each year. When World War I began in 1914, Britain faced a choice: remain neutral and watch Europe destroy itself, or enter the war and risk bankrupting the empire. Britain chose to fight. World War I cost Britain over $40 billion, equivalent to approximately $1 trillion in today's currency. Britain borrowed massively, primarily from the United States. By 1918, Britain had transitioned from the world's largest creditor nation to a major debtor. Stage 2 was currency debasement through inflation and eventual abandonment of the gold standard. Before World War I, the pound was backed by gold reserves. £1 equaled a fixed amount of gold. But the war drained Britain's gold reserves. Gold was shipped to America to pay for weapons, food, and supplies. By 1920, Britain's gold reserves were half their 1914 levels. In 1925, Britain returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. This was an economic disaster. The pound was overvalued, making British exports uncompetitively expensive. Manufacturing declined, unemployment rose. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard entirely. The pound lost 25% of its value overnight. The global reserve currency had just admitted it could not maintain its promises. This was monetary debasement on a national scale. Stage 3 was the debt spiral. Britain never recovered from World War I debt before World War II began. World War II cost Britain an additional $120 billion. By 1945, Britain owed the United States and Canada over $30 billion, more than Britain's entire gross domestic product. The interest payments alone consumed a massive portion of government revenue. Britain was trapped in exactly the debt spiral that had destroyed Spain centuries earlier. Stage 4 was loss of economic empire and productive capacity. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India, the crown jewel of the empire and the source of enormous wealth for 2 centuries. Over the next 20 years, Britain lost nearly all colonial possessions. Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. Each loss meant lost markets, lost resources, and lost revenue. Simultaneously, British manufacturing declined as production shifted to America, Germany, and Japan. By 1970, Britain was no longer a major manufacturing power. The productive capacity that had built the empire was gone. Stage 5 was social and political crisis. The 1970s brought economic chaos to Britain. Inflation exceeded 20%. Strikes paralyzed industry. The government imposed a 3-day workweek to conserve electricity. In 1976, Britain required a loan from the International Monetary Fund, a humiliating admission that the former economic superpower could not manage its own finances. This was social and institutional breakdown driven by decades of economic mismanagement. Stage 6 was loss of reserve currency status. The pound's decline was mathematically brutal. In 1940, £1 equaled $4.03. By 1950, $2.80. By 1970, $2.40. By 1980, $2.30. Today, £1 equals approximately $1.27. The currency that once dominated global finance became just another regional currency. Central banks around the world diversified away from pounds and into dollars. The reserve currency status shifted to America. Britain avoided Stage 7, complete collapse, by transitioning into a junior partner role with the United States. Britain maintains a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council and possesses nuclear weapons. But economically, Britain is a shadow of its former self. The empire is gone and will never return. The lesson is clear. Economic laws cannot be violated indefinitely, even by the most powerful empire in the world. The United States emerged from World War II as the dominant economic superpower. The dollar became the global reserve currency in 1944 under the Bretton Woods system. American manufacturing was unmatched. American productivity was the highest in the world. The United States was the world's largest creditor nation. For several decades, America's economic dominance seemed unshakable. But examine the current situation through the lens of the 7-stage pattern, and the picture becomes deeply concerning. Stage 1. Military overextension. The United States maintains over 750 military bases in approximately 80 countries. American troops are deployed in over 150 countries worldwide. The United States is committed to defending Europe through NATO, defending Japan and South Korea, defending the Philippines, maintaining military presence throughout the Middle East, and countering China in the Pacific. The annual military budget exceeds $850 billion, more than the next 10 countries combined. Despite this massive spending, the military is stretched thin. Equipment is aging. Recruitment falls short of targets. If multiple major conflicts erupted simultaneously, American forces could not respond effectively to all of them. This is overextension. Stage 2. Currency debasement. In 1971, President Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. The dollar became pure fiat currency, backed by nothing except government decree. Since 2000, the money supply has increased approximately 400%. Since 2020, the Federal Reserve has created over $6 trillion through quantitative easing and emergency lending programs. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. What cost $1 in 1971 costs over $30 today. The mechanism differs from Spain mixing copper into silver, but the result is identical: currency debasement. Stage 3. Debt spiral. The United States federal debt exceeds $36 trillion, approximately 120% of gross domestic product. Annual interest payments on this debt are approaching $1 trillion, exceeding defense spending. The government runs deficits every single year, including during periods of economic growth. In 2024, the deficit exceeded $1,800 billion, despite relatively strong economic conditions. This is deficit spending during peacetime prosperity. The United States borrows to pay interest on previous borrowing. That is the textbook definition of a debt spiral. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity. America's manufacturing base has been systematically dismantled over the past 4 decades. Production has shifted to China, Mexico, Vietnam, and other low-cost regions. The United States runs an annual trade deficit exceeding $800 billion, meaning imports exceed exports by that amount. America is dependent on foreign supply chains for critical goods. Pharmaceuticals, electronics, steel, rare earth elements, and even components for military equipment are largely imported. Just as Spain became dependent on imports while silver flowed out, America is dependent on imports while dollars flow out. Stage 5. Social and institutional decay. Trust in major institutions has reached historic lows. Political dysfunction prevents necessary economic reforms. Infrastructure deteriorates. Drug overdoses kill over 100,000 Americans annually. Homelessness has increased dramatically in major cities. Fertility rates have dropped below replacement level. The most talented individuals increasingly seek opportunities outside traditional institutions or leave the country entirely. These are symptoms of social decay driven by economic stagnation. The United States has completed 5 of the 7 stages. Stage 6, loss of reserve currency status, shows early warning signs. BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems. Central banks worldwide are diversifying reserves and accumulating gold. China and Russia conduct bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, bypassing the dollar entirely. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting yuan for oil sales, breaking the decades-old petrodollar system. These are cracks in dollar dominance. Stage 7 is complete economic collapse. The pattern suggests this comes suddenly, not gradually. The Soviet Union went from superpower to non-existent in less than 3 years. Britain lost its empire in 2 decades. Spain took longer but never recovered. When reserve currency status fails, when debt becomes unsustainable, when military commitments cannot be funded, empires do not decline gracefully. They collapse rapidly and brutally. 3 empires over 2,000 years. 3 complete economic collapses, all following the same 7-stage pattern with remarkable consistency. Why does this pattern repeat? Because economic laws are mathematical, not political. You cannot spend more than you produce indefinitely. You cannot maintain empire without productive capacity. You cannot debase currency without destroying its value. You cannot borrow infinitely without facing a reckoning. These are not opinions. These are economic realities that have held true across centuries and civilizations. Rome believed Roman engineering and military discipline made them exceptional. Spain believed controlling the world's silver made them invincible. Britain believed the empire was ordained by destiny. All 3 were wrong. Their power was based on economic productivity, and when that productivity eroded, their power evaporated regardless of how exceptional they believed themselves to be. The United States tells itself the same story today. We believe American technology and innovation make us different. We believe the dollar's dominance is permanent. We believe economic laws do not apply to us. But the pattern says otherwise. The mathematics says otherwise. And history, which has watched empires repeat the same mistakes over and over, says we are following the exact same path. Perhaps America will find a way to reverse course. Perhaps we will reform, rebuild productive capacity, restore fiscal discipline, and avoid the fate of Rome, Spain, and Britain. Perhaps this time truly is different. But the pattern has never been broken. Not once, not ever. 3 empires, 3 collapses, 3 confirmations that economic fundamentals cannot be violated without consequences. The 7-stage pattern is not a prophecy. It is a warning based on documented historical fact. And right now, the United States has completed 5 stages and shows clear signs of entering stage 6. The pattern does not guarantee collapse tomorrow or next year, but it does say that collapse becomes increasingly probable the further into the sequence an empire travels. And when collapse comes to empires that have violated these economic principles, it comes suddenly and comprehensively. The question is not whether the pattern applies to America. The question is whether we will recognize the pattern in time to change course. History suggests we will not, the mathematics suggests we cannot, and the pattern suggests the outcome is already determined. 3 times before, empires learned this lesson too late. We are about to become the 4th.